Welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast, where we aim to educate and inspire you about how technology is changing and shaping our profession. The truth is, there's never been a more exciting time to be in procurement, but only if you're one of those organizations that's embracing the change and driving new developments. And this podcast is all about giving you the tools to help you get there. So buckle up and let's get right into this week's show. Greetings, ProcureTech fanboys and fangirls. Welcome to another episode of the show. Today, we're going to be tackling a subject that is very, very relevant to the digital procurement landscape, but is going a little bit off-piste in that we're not talking about technology specifically, but rather more of a mindset that is needed to adopt a digital-first strategy and to really embed that way of thinking within your organization. Yes, I'm talking about entrepreneurial procurement. What is that? I hear you say. Bear with me. We're going to dive straight into that. But before I do, just wanted to let you know about Procurement Software.site. We are the official podcast of Procurement Software.site. And on our website, if you go to app.procurementsoftware.site, we have a directory of over 440 procurement technology solutions that you can search and filter completely free of charge. Without having to pay us a single cent, you can find the procurement technology that matches your specific search criteria in less time than it takes to boil an egg. One of the reasons why I started this business was to really democratize access to this data, especially if you're a small procurement team and you don't have the budget to go out and buy a subscription to one of the big analyst firms. What we are all about is democratizing access to that data and enabling more people to take advantage of the amazing apps and technology that is out there now in the digital procurement space. So, entrepreneurial procurement, what is it and what's the challenge? Well, in the procurement team of the future, if we are really going to make that step away from being considered just a cost savings function and instead be more revered within the business as a total driver of added value to an organization, both from a top line revenue generator as well as a bottom line savings generator, then we need to adapt a more entrepreneurial mindset to be able to deliver that. All too often in the past, I feel that procurement had predominantly been staffed by people with a more technocratic mindset. And while there's nothing wrong with that per se, and there's a lot of qualities associated with that in terms of thoroughness, in terms of how people approach something from a process and compliance perspective, I do think that this somewhat rigid mindset focused on adherence to a certain set way of doing things kind of needs to go the way of the dinosaurs nowadays, because it kind of pushes a more box-ticking mindset, which means that process is often put before pragmatism. And I think in today's digital world, we live in such a fast-paced environment that oftentimes the procurement processes of yesteryear getting too bulky and too long-winded to enable us to react at the speed that the business often expects us to. What I'm getting at here is that historically, the end result had often been considered less important than making sure that you focus on following the set process that's been designated of how procurement should work and how procurement should operate. It's kind of like we didn't question the why, and we just focused instead on the what and the how of how we go about delivering that. Where I think that we need to change if we're going to really take advantage of all of these technological advances and applications and no-code tools that I spoke about a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, is that procurement needs to think a lot more like a business owner as a function. I think most people that work in procurement do have the capability and do possess the business acumen But I don't know, maybe it's just my perception, but I think we just have it hammered into us to be very technocratic and process driven in our roles. And maybe that is just the corporate environment just being a bit too stiff and a bit too rigid in some ways. But what I think we need to do going forward is to focus on the why rather than the what and the how. So why do we do the things that we do? That may often mean that we have to bend the rules to get things done. And by that, I don't mean taking bribes or ignoring things like child labor or modern slavery or anything like that. Of course, we have to have processes, we have to have controls, we have to have regulation. What I mean by that is that sometimes we're not going to have time to follow the 7-step sourcing process, for example, or to do a detailed RFP for something that is business critical. And we may have to take a more pragmatic approach of when we apply that. So instead of us being process focused, I think the more entrepreneurial skill set means that we need to be more results oriented and focus on pragmatism over process. And I'm going to give a few examples of what I mean by that. So if you're a head of procurement, my challenge to you would be to think about your overall budget that you have for your team as more than just the wage or salary bill that you have, plus maybe a little bit of money for travel and expenses and to spend on a little bit of consultancy here and there. Instead of thinking of it that way, I want you to think of your total budget for your procurement department as being a little bit like your budget if you're a business owner and you're running a business. So if we're going to move away from being considered the spend police, being the business function that's responsible for driving total value that permeates from managing relationships with suppliers and our internal business stakeholders, we need to think about this a little bit more holistically. So instead of just thinking, okay, how many heads can I afford in my team? Maybe you need fewer permanent staff, and maybe you just need to be able to flex up and down based on specific project requirements. So instead of thinking, okay, I need X number of heads to be able to effectively deliver my savings target, maybe instead the right way to approach it as a business owner would be, okay, so maybe I need X number of fixed heads that can do the foundational functions that I need to be able to run my function. But then if I've got specific projects that I need to deliver, perhaps it's a better approach to bring in interim managers or freelance consultants that can deliver that project faster and better and have a greater impact on the business than what you might be able to deliver having job for life type corporate procurement folks that perhaps don't have that business entrepreneurial mindset that a freelance consultant or an interim manager might be able to have if he or she comes in and hits the ground running and delivers a project ahead of schedule just because of their deep category knowledge of specific area that they're coming in to. So I think bringing in subject matter experts on a fractional or an interim basis is one area where you can do that. I always also think that technology, we always have this discussion, don't we, about how can procurement leaders convince the CFO to get a budget for procurement tech? Well, maybe you don't need to. Maybe you just need to approach budget that you would have previously been spending on full-time equivalents on FTEs and think, well, okay, if one or two people leave my team, instead of replacing them, why don't I then pitch the business case to the CFO to say, I don't need to replace them, but I do need that budget that I would otherwise have spent on salaries to go out and buy some technology. And that technology can then take away a lot of the administrative workload from the remaining category team. And through that, the category team can spend more work on savings and stakeholder management and actually delivering their category strategies instead of doing all of this unnecessary day-to-day admin that could be eliminated or automated if you have the right technology in place. So that's one area where you can perhaps allocate your budget differently by adopting a more business savvy mindset. The other part of it is around retention of your A players and your star performance star performers. Each time one of your team leaves and you have to go out and replace them, not only does that entail recruitment costs, but it's also in most cases going to be at least 3, probably 6 months before that new team member has really got their feet under the table and is firing on all cylinders. No matter how much category experience they might have, it's going to take them that time to embed it within your organization, to understand the culture, to understand the business processes, to get to know the supply base that they're dealing with and their key account managers on the supplier side, business stakeholders, establish relationships, build trust. Wouldn't it be better just to invest in learning and development and training and to really assess what your existing team's needs are to be able to allow them to sort of kick on and step up a level rather than losing people? I think about this a little bit like how professional football teams or soccer teams, if you're listening to this in the US, would operate. So think about it this way. If you need to break your wage bill structure to keep a star performer, wouldn't that be better to pay them maybe $10,000, $20,000 or euro or pounds more than what you had in your original budget, but knowing that you're going to be able to retain their services and have them be star performers in the years to come, rather than losing them just over a really rigid salary band that HR formulates and forces you under? You're going to spend what you would have spent on that person's salary just in recruitment costs and in just loss of potential, because it's going to take 3 to 6 months to embed that new team member that you're recruiting into your organization. And, I don't mean, hold on to every single person regardless of whether they're any good or not. Of course not. If you've got someone that's an average performer and they hand in their notice, then yeah, let them go. It's probably best for your business. But if you're losing star people because of rigid salary bands that are forced on you by HR, isn't it time to step up as a leader and, grow a backbone and have that discussion with the chief HR officer or with the CFO and say, look, this isn't sound business sense to do this. It's madness. In corporate, we often sit in our little boxes and don't challenge the status quo. And yes, I know, everyone has to be careful what they say because they have mortgages to pay and kids to finance through university. But aren't we employed to ask those challenging questions and to be disruptors? I think adopting a more business owner type mindset would give you the courage to approach those discussions in a different light. So, that's a big one as well around people and training and retention of your best people. Then the final one that I wanted to look at, well, the final couple, is first of all, process. So you may not know this, but tech startups typically, before they go to market, they develop something called an MVP, which stands for minimum viable product. And what that means is that if they bring the product to the market and it doesn't work, it means that they can, what they call, fail fast. So if they've built something that's just a minimum product, they can then learn from that if it doesn't resonate with the market and then build a reiteration of it relatively quickly. And this, the fail first mindset or minimum viable process or mindset, I think can be adopted into our procurement processes too. If we take that acronym, the MVP, and call it minimum viable process, what's the bare minimum of process that you need to enable you to fulfill the corporate risk and compliance requirements, but without suffocating the creativity and the agility that your procurement team has, or indeed your procurement team in the magic triangle, procurement plus supplier plus internal stakeholders? How can they be as creative and as innovative as possible without being stifled by unnecessary bureaucracy and process? And yes, I acknowledge, that we have to have corporate governance. It's there for a reason and it does good work. I'm certainly not advocating that we get rid of it completely, but I do think certainly in large enterprise organizations that, departments like legal and internal audit often create process for process's sake because they have to justify their existence. And I think if procurement could challenge that and say, hey, let's adopt a startup mentality and go for minimum viable process, MVP, what's the absolute minimum that we need to have? And how can we then inject more creativity and agility into an organization through not stifling them with process? And then finally, I wanted to talk about business partnering as a mindset as well, and how by thinking more like a business owner, we can really align our goals with those of the wider business, thinking of them as our users and getting the CFO on board that procurement as a function is an investment. It's not a cost. It's telling, isn't it, that procurement still to this day in most organizations is seen of as a cost center rather than a profit center. And I think if we can have that business partnering mode process, an entrepreneurial mindset, business acumen that can really push that investing in procurement, investing in technology around supplier relationship management, automation in the procurement process, and having clean data and having things like AI that can help write RFPs and contracts. This is an investment. It's a long-term investment rather than a cost, especially on data. You know, I've said this time and time again with stuff that I do on LinkedIn, but Amazon is not really an e-commerce company. Tinder is not really a dating app. Airbnb is not a guest booking platform. They are, at the end of the day, all data companies. Data is the new gold. And if all of these wildly successful tech companies didn't collect infinite amounts of data points on their users, they would not be a fraction as successful as they have been. And that is the one thought that I'd like to leave you with at the end of today's episode around how we can instill entrepreneurial thinking into procurement, is that think of it like tech startups do in terms of how important data is to them and how minimum viable process can allow us to be more creative and more agile in the day-to-day work that we do to drive savings and revenue to the businesses that we work in. Love to get your thoughts on this. Drop me an email or drop me a DM on LinkedIn if you've got thoughts on how procurement can make the journey from being technocratic to being more entrepreneurial. Or indeed, if you disagree with me and you'd like to come at it another way, I'd love to have that chat. Maybe even bring you on the show to argue the case against, if you think I'm talking rubbish. But do reach out to me. I'd love to get your comments. As always, love to take feedback from anyone that's listening to the show and hear your thought on the topics of the day. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back again, same time next week. Until then, wish you a good, productive rest of your week, and bye for now.